We will now introduce the book of Numbers, a book characterized by a considerable amount of grumbling in the wilderness. The English title Numbers is based on the Septuagint, which labels the book arithmoi, which sounds a lot like arithmetic, having to do with numbers. Refers to, among other things, a census in Numbers chapters 1 through 4, and a second census in Numbers chapter 26. The Hebrew title is In the Desert, Be Midbar, that just takes the first couple of words from the beginning of the book, which is not a bad title in some ways, since they do in fact begin in this book still in the desert. As far as authorship, this continues the story of Exodus and Leviticus, which itself continues the story of Genesis. And the authorship of this section of the Pentateuch is the same as Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus. Conservatives will say it's essentially Mosaic with updates, what we call the modified conservative view. Liberals will often follow the documentary hypothesis of Wellhausen or some variation thereof, and say that the book is P-source intertwined with J.E. Geographically, the movement starts from Sinai in chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 10 and verse 10. They are still camped at Mount Sinai. But then they will move to Kadesh Barnea in Numbers chapter 10, verse 11 to chapter 20 and verse 13. Unfortunately, at Kadesh Barnea, they'll have a failure of faith where they will refuse to enter the land of promise, Numbers 13 and chapter 14. But then the last part of the book, they begin the movement towards the promised land from Kadesh to Moab, on the way to capturing Jericho at the beginning of the book of Joshua. Chronologically, this book covers 40 years. After failing to enter the land in chapters 13 and 14, they will be condemned to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, where they'll travel in the vicinity of Kadesh Barnea on the southern border of Canaan, and there will be a number of tragic events recorded during those 40 years. At the end of the 40 years, they will begin their movement from the desert to the land of Moab on the way to conquer Jericho. The book is named after the two censuses that are taken, one in the first 4 chapters and another 40 years later, or nearly 40 years later in chapter 26. In both cases, they add up to about 600,000 men, which means that there's similar numbers before the wilderness wanderings and after the wilderness wanderings. Now, if there are 600,000 males, not counting women and children, then that would suggest a total population of roughly 2.5 million. The theological lesson for the lack of growth is that during this period, God did not bless Israel with increase in number due to his judgment on Israel's unbelief. Now, there's a historical and critical problem here. Are the census numbers too large? Critical scholars, liberal scholars, tend to reject the census numbers as simply too big. Some say the numbers were made up. Some say that perhaps the text is garbled in some way. The word for thousands, Hebrew elef, can sometimes mean clans, and so it wasn't 600 thousands, but maybe 600 clans, which would be a much smaller number. Liberals will reject the numbers in part because they recognize that it would take a miracle for so many people to survive in the horrible Sinai desert. And if you don't believe in miracles, and liberal scholars tend to either not believe or downplay it, well, then you need to explain it away. Conservatives will come back and say, well, the numbers are possible. The Israelites were said to be in Egypt for 430 years. If couples averaged about 4 to 5 reproducing children each, starting with the 70 individuals that went down to Egypt, over the course of 430 years, they could, in theory, grow to 2.5 million individuals. But that said, these numbers remain difficult even if you are more conservative in your theological outlook. For example, it says that there were 7 nations greater and mightier than you, referring to Israel, in Deuteronomy 7 and verse 1, and that Israel is the fewest of all peoples. But that seems like a rather odd statement. How could there be 7 nations larger than 2.5 million? That would make for a population much larger than modern Israel today. And it appears that modern Israel today has the largest population that that region has ever supported. The midwives, back in the book of Exodus, there were 2 midwives that seemed to serve the Hebrews. Well, how could 2 women serve such a large group? Of course, you could answer that they were leaders of the midwives rather than midwives for all the Israelites. 600 chariots of Pharaoh terrorized the Israelites, but how could 600 chariots terrify 600,000 men? One would think that you could just, surround them and swamp them just by virtue of numbers, if there were that many men. And at the Battle of Ai, the Israelites are emotionally devastated by a loss of 36 Israelite men. But what's the loss of 36 men if you have 600,000 troops in the army to begin with? So even conservative scholars wonder if perhaps the numbers are not to be taken at face value. David Fouts wrote an article some years ago suggesting that perhaps the numbers are deliberate hyperbole, which he sees as a convention in military writings both in Israel and Assyria. And if you take that view, you might be able to divide the numbers by 10 and get a number that's more reasonable. Instead of 600,000, something closer to 60,000. It's interesting in that regard that all the numbers tend to end in a 0. Or perhaps there was some other convention now unknown to us that was utilized by the writers. In any case, the numbers remain a problem, and there's yet to be a fully satisfactory solution to it. Now, as they set out from Egypt, the plan was for Israel to camp around the tabernacle, with the tabernacle being at the center of the camp. You can get an idea what that was like with this table. You have the tabernacle in the middle, surrounded by the various Levites, Aaron and his sons, to the east, facing the entrance of the tabernacle. And then Judah in the front, Ephraim in the rear, and the other nations, the other tribes of Israel camped around the tabernacle. Only Levites could serve the sanctuary, and in Numbers 3 it speaks of how the Levites came to serve as a substitute for the firstborn. Priestly matters about Levites and priests are interspersed throughout the book of Numbers. You have an example of it in chapter 6, the Aaronic prayer. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. a verse that is quoted in the Katif Hinon silver amulets dating to the 7th century BC, as we talked about when we talked about the texts of the Old Testament. An almost exact quote of this. The book of Numbers has a mixture of law and narratives, and so let me say a few words about some laws, and then we'll turn to narratives. There's a law for a woman suspected of adultery, and she had to go through a ritual where she would swear an oath that she did not do the thing that her husband suspects her of. And it looks like a strange law, but the purpose was to curb lynch mob mentality and protect a hapless woman from false accusations. Go through the ritual, the husband has to shut up. You have the Nazirite law, where either a man or a woman could take a special type of vow and be, for a period of time, usually about a month probably, dedicated to God. It was a time of special dedication. Paul took such a Nazirite vow in Acts chapter 18, and the sacrifices at the end of the vow in Acts chapter 21. At least by New Testament times, typically a Nazirite vow was for 1 month. Judaism has no longer does Nazirite vows, in part because they can't offer the sacrifices at the end. Nazirites were to avoid 3 things: eating anything made out of grape, either wine or grape products, cutting one's hair, Samson is a famous example of that, or touching the dead. You have a law about a Sabbath violator who chopped wood during the Sabbath being put to death. Shows how seriously they took keeping the law. There is a law of purification for corpse contamination, described in Numbers chapter 19, a ritual involving the ashes of a red heifer. And I have some outside readings that I would ask you to read to get more details on this in the plan. You have a case of murder where the Bible distinguishes in Numbers chapter 35 between deliberate murder and unintentional manslaughter, a distinction that any just system of law is going to make. And then you have the case of the daughters of Zelophehad in Numbers 27 and Numbers chapter 36. The problem was of handing down inheritance. Normally it only went to sons, but what if there are no sons? And in such cases, the Lord revealed to Moses that daughters could inherit, though with some limitations. And this represents an expansion for the rights of women in Moses' day. The next lecture will talk about the narratives in Numbers.